flip myself and make sure I have the slides up that I need to present to you all just ever so shortly. We'll start at 3 minutes past the top of the hour. Ready. All right, I see a good SME quorum. And the good thing is that hopefully at the end of this meeting, you all will enable all of your friends in the user ecosystem to review what we've crafted and ensure it's fit for purpose. So I'm going to start in now. It's 4:03 and we can get going on the presentation of the classification and going from there. And it looks like we don't have a ton of additional community members, but we can just keep on talking on the classification if that's what it comes to. And Rob, welcome. Oh, Linda is here too. We have some non-program classification subject matter experts on the meeting, even though they're certainly experts in terminology. Next slide. All right, so not a large group today. Welcome that you're all here. We do start muted, but you're always welcome to come off mute if you have any questions. The calls are recorded and we ensure that they're available in the Confluence. And please actively participate. We are grateful that all of you are here. Next slide. We are required to follow antitrust practices and we have the responsibility to comply fully with federal and state antitrust laws. I'm just going to skip right through. So adherence to these guidelines involves not only avoidance of antitrust violations, but avoidance of behavior that might be so construed. So thank you for aligning with these guidelines. It is a requirement as a standards organization. So next slide. Lots of Sarahs, but again, most of us are part of the classification SME huddle that happens every Thursday in the morning. And so if people want to come off mic, that's great. And then I just want to note that if you are joining this call, we will not be covering food as medicine concepts and coding for food in great depth. Please feel free to stay and be part of this conversation. We're going to be leaning into program enhancement concepts, specifically our program classification work. Our first public update on the coding for food work should happen next meeting on the 26th, which is our alternating cycle. So just want to note for everyone's reference, we're deeply into program classification today. Brief coding for food update, coming back to you with coding for food concepts on the 26th of September. And so we'll go through the coding for food update ever so briefly, and then really a deep dive into program classification and where we stand, and maybe even having some time to think about methods of representing it, and then go into our community homework and next steps. And community homework, I'm going to say this again, it's not, if it might not be you doing the homework if you are a SME, but it could be you sending the classification to your end users and your community, posting it in like a blog or a newsletter of sorts, ensuring that your end users analyze it for function and give us back feedback. Next slide. All right, so announcements. Next slide. I just want to note that we presented on the Utility and Security IC10CM at the IC10 Coordination and Maintenance Committee on September 10th. You can follow and get the agenda. I'm sorry, there's like a few. And you can look at the agenda at the link there. I do want to note that even though our presentation was brief, it was incredibly well received. We got a lot of comments after the fact and only positive comments during the proposal. So congratulations to the Gravity team for that work. And again, for all of our friends in the ecosystem who help us with our IC10CM. We have lots of experts who help us with those submissions. We do want to note that the technical work stream has published the clinical care IGSTU 2.2. You can view it. Always come to the Gravity technical implementation meetings, Wednesdays 1 to 2. We are really trying to think about what's next. We know we have a really critical update to align with US Core, and that's the major focus of work this fall. But we are trying to figure out new use cases, new opportunities, and considerations. And that meeting is a great place to go for technical considerations. And then our next meeting, also on September 26th, so September 26th is the big day, is terminology implementation tips and tricks, revising a presentation I gave at the CMS Connect-a-thon that was really well received, elevating a leader in terminology implementation in the member ecosystem elements. That will be September 26th, 2:30 to 4 p.m. EST in the implementation affinity group. And then, as I mentioned, that's this next meeting. So that is also the first time we'll be bringing coding for food concepts to this meeting in addition to our program enhancements work. Any questions on these announcements? All right, next slide. Next slide. Because it's so many people who are familiar, I am going to move through the background slides. So what is Gravity? Gravity is a collaborative initiative. It's all of you, with a goal to develop consensus-driven data standards to support the collection, use, and exchange of data to address the social determinants of health. Next slide. Ever so grateful for our growing members and our critical voices across our vast amount of expertise in our members. I always do try to note that we are a bit unique when it comes to HL7 work groups, and that we do have designated members that we identify as being super critical to the mission of social justice and health equity. So there's a lot of member financial supporters, but also, given that this is our governance structure, we have intentional representation from community-based organizations, patients, and entities that are really at the direct care provision in the medical and social care integration. Next slide. We also have extensive in-kind support. Couldn't do without them. Roadmap has not changed. We're still trying, we are working through language barriers and incarceration status in our new domain terminology meeting, which alternates with this one. Anyone who's been in that meeting notes the agenda is quite full, which is why we had to carve out this meeting to be specifically on program enhancements, including program classification and coding for food. Again, classification today, and then going into coding for food and classification in 2 weeks' time. We are continually talking about some of our new use case discoveries, leaning into payment and reporting and outcomes and tracking. I do want to note that one of the primary findings from the payment and reporting sprint was the need for terminology to support reimbursement, to support in lieu of services and Medicaid waivers. And so this directly aligns with the work that we do here. So coding for food is a great example of terminology leading into that of finding from the member use case discovery and building terminology to support reimbursable services to support in Medicaid programs. So even though some elements of that are to be determined, we're already leaning into the member prioritized and ecosystem prioritized first finding, which was a paucity of terminology to support provision of the programs and services so critical for social care. As you can see in the fall, we're continuing that, as I mentioned, the primary focus of the STO ballot is aligned with US Core 6.1, but we are exploring other things. And then implementation affinity group reconvenes in September as noted. And then one thing of note that we're trying to work on, and I mentioned this kind of for the first time here, is really trying to create artifacts of our consensus findings that are not just our codes. We do a lot of thinking on really sticky wickets, as I say. I said that for Jacob here from Epic. So we talk about really critical things because we are on literally the bleeding edge of terminology and standards to support medical and social care integration. So in align with that last improving education dissemination for implementers, we're also trying to create artifacts that represent consensus findings on even just conceptual topics. So look for some of those blooming over the course of the next few months. We're leaning into our member experts to help craft those, just given an all hands on deck approach. And so we'll be presenting those in our communities after they get vetted through our governance meetings shortly. An example of that is the conversation we had on the capacity for structure maps to generate condition codes and the need for wrapping around with effective ethics and process to ensure patient-centeredness. So again, we'll bring those concepts back. Our members are leading drafting of those, and we'll bring those through our governance structure to ensure full endorsement. And then we can post them publicly as artifacts and findings. Next slide. I think we're good. Oh, so this is just the fall plan. We've talked about it a lot. There's 2 meetings. We have one meeting on new domain terminology development, another meeting on enhancements. Look for this pattern to start to be integrated into the meeting invite so you can know where you are supposed to be. Everyone who's here, I recognize you. So it seems like everyone knew that to be here for this purpose. But again, in all of our communication, we want to make sure that people can navigate where they're supposed to go. That's actually literally the topic of the program classification, so it's appropriate. We just want to, so we're going to be trying to name the meetings differently so people can figure out where they need to be based on the calendar. Next slide. This looks familiar because this is the way it always is. New domain terminology is like a machine, a gentle, compassionate machine, but a machine. So language barriers and incarceration status are domains of reference. They meet next week and they met last week, and we continue to work toward our consensus vote on November 21st. That's all very the way it always is, right? We do this thing at this week and this thing at this week and this thing at this week, and it's all the process, and it's now a published thing. Next slide. And here it's a little bit different because we're actually very focused on what the deliverables are. So most of the community intervention and engagement is going to be just on reviewing, right? There are only 3 coding for food concepts. There are no more. Those are the 3 concepts we're focusing on. So it's not going to be submitting concepts, it's going to be reviewing, right? And same thing here. Like, we want you to review the classification that we're making. It certainly means commenting on gaps if you see them, but mostly it's just reviewing the classification. So unlike some new domain work where you can submit a program you think is critical or a role you think is critical, this is mostly community engagement by review, as I mentioned. So we will post the, as we'll mention at the end, we will post the draft classification by tomorrow, as we always do on Friday afternoon. You will be able to download it. We're actually going to walk through the classification on the call today. And then the goal is to gather your people and submit classification feedbacks by the Tuesday before the next meeting. So, so in this instance, it's 9/24, right? And then we can synthesize those findings in our SME meeting that Thursday and carry on. We're hoping to give you enough time to get feedback, but also ensure that we have time to digest and synthesize. Does that make sense? So nothing new submitting, just reviewing and disseminating. It looks like it makes sense. You all are very patient with me today. Most of you are SMEs, lots of people I know on this call. Next slide. All right, any questions on the flow of the fall? I'm calling it fall already. All right, next slide. All right, so next we're going to go briefly into coding for food, and then we're going to go straight into classification and talk about where we are and how to engage in it, and make sure that everyone understands how to navigate the classification spreadsheet. We might end up early, who knows? Next slide. I always say that, and then it's a bad thing to say. So regarding coding for food, we will come back in 2 weeks with the first presentation of the findings of the subject matter expert groups. We've been meeting, and we meet every other week, and our job is to synthesize, definitions and HICPIC submissions on these 3 different concepts. And so it's going to be a little bit different what people are responding to, because people are responding to components of a HICPIC submission that we will, in a HICPIC ensuing definition that we will submit to MIRAS in January. And so it's, again, just 3 different concepts, and akin to, thank you, Sarah, akin to classification, the primary role is for review, right? You're not going to be submitting new things. The community will be reviewing things. And so those of you in the Foodist Medicine ecosystem, please gather your people, come to that September 26th call. I will be presenting next week at the National Produce Prescription Coalition Summit in DC, and I'm sure I'm going to be making sure everyone comes from there as well. But again, it's responding to those 3 concepts is our work in coding for food, and reconvening in the first real public call on this concept on 9/26. So gather your folks, for that concept. And there's tons of resources on coding for food because it's been 2 years in the making. Next slide. All right, and again, as always, all of the materials we talk about, again, nothing for coding for food yet until the public call on the 26th, but they're posted by Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific time, the day after the public call. And so for this meeting, the program classification draft will be posted by Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific time in the program classification section, which is in the, you can see it on the slide. So it's the last arrow on the left. Thank you, Molly. You're the best. I want to note naming conventions there as well. So as like, and sometimes we're building terminology just for one domain, right? And so that's the social risk domain build process. It's that form, like normative incarceration status, language access, like that whole work. But with the program classification, it's cross-domain work, so it's in a separate section. And as I noted, the coding for food is going to be is an enhancement of food insecurity, so it's under food insecurity. You will find the masters there when they are posted. You will find the program classification posted underneath the cross-domain build header. Next slide. All right, here we go. Next slide. Again, feel free to pipe in. It's a very small group. And you all, most of you are, I'm going to keep on saying this, most of you are the subject matter experts I meet with every Thursday morning. All right. So program enhancements are 3 topic areas. Alina, thanks for letting me know you're there. Our 3 topic areas, and they are more intersected than I anticipated, are program term analysis, which is a review of gravity program types and definitions for completeness. And I want to know, this is the surprise. You're going to see this as we go forward. I had no idea how many gaps in program types that I would be presented when we started the program classification. There's a whole coding that I've had to do to identify program gaps. And so this is part of this bidirectional analysis that we do in the program classification, where we develop groupers and then we, from gravity, look back, and we'll walk through that very shortly. The second topic is the program classification itself. It's the topic of the day, which is the open consensus program classification of gravity programs, and not just gravity programs, for the purposes of navigation and connection. And then we still have some work to do on program documentation. This is on pause, right? This is on hold right now because the gravity team has identified all kinds of questions we want to resolve internally and then bring it back to the group. So we are convening internally on program documentation, listening to everything that you all have said so far, thinking about possible solutions, and then we'll come back to this meeting in this meeting cycle with those findings once we have had that meeting. But program classification and unexpectedly, program term analysis is the topic of the day. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Here we are. So we are in the public convening portion. We're still in the identify phase. And again, it's different because the community is not as leading in the identification phase because they really are trying to respond more directly to the SME classification. Same thing with coding for food. We will then enter into end-to-end review later on and then have our consensus vote in November. And then we are going to be submitting any gaps to standard code systems and publishing the classification as a next step. Next slide. Again, this is the work we've done. We had led up to it. So we have our subject matter experts, really grateful for all of them, just learning so much from all of you and with all of you. And then we have weekly meetings, and we've been meeting weekly since May 16th. We're doing it, guys. Like, but there's a lot of internal agreement on requirements, and now we're just rolling. We'll see that domains we've addressed and domains to be determined very shortly. And so the role of the subject matter experts are defining the rules for the structure, analyzing the existing classifications across each of the different classifications of reference, and there are few, synthesizing those classifications, and then crafting the initial classification. So it's that initial classification that's really in the best view you all have seen it in, that we'll be talking about today, and you'll have a chance to review tomorrow. Next slide. Again, for anyone, and I say this on reference, it's really important that when we're analyzing the classification that we're thinking about functional structure. Each of the classifications that exist that our subject matter experts represent has been modified by function. Like, does it work? And so we want to be wary of purely conceptual comments, because if it's not put through a functional filter, it's not going to meet the needs of the revision, right? So we always have to think about function, because each of those SMEs are constantly representing function in their decision making internally. And so when we get public and community comments, just make sure everyone's keeping function in mind, and think of it when it comes to the homework. So does this work? Does this make sense? Aligned with the purpose of navigation and connection. Next slide. We do know the next two slides are what we already know. This is just some of the assumptions we're just putting in here. So we're going to have this open classification. It's going to have codified concepts. And the great thing about this is, even if our use case for our structure is limited, to navigation and connection, the amazing thing about the concepts, once they're codified, is they're able to be leveraged for all kinds of different use cases. Directories, maybe facilitate documentation of service provision and enrollment, maybe, leveraging interconnection with other non-open taxonomies. There's a million different ways we can use our concepts once we define them. So that's part of the exciting thing toward the greater goal of interoperability and efficiency. Next slide. And then we do know we are going to publish it. We just still have to figure out why. Rob, we had some conversations about this in the last meeting. Once we get that structure, I think the structure is actually nailed down enough, that we can start thinking about how. And we'll reserve time for that. We didn't prep, I didn't include my technical friends in this meeting enough to represent that and discuss that today, but we will circle back with that ever so shortly, and happy to talk offline. There were many, many, many offline conversations on the structure of classification before we even started. I think in my discussions with all this terminology subject matter experts I met with, there were at least 5 different possible methods and places of publishing our classification. So looking forward to settling on one out in time. Next slide. Okay, we're going to get into the classification content now. Am I missing something? Oh no, Sarah's just dropping stuff. Okay, next slide. So this is where we are. Subject matter experts are presenting the classification with rationales. The community will review it, and we'll iterate until we vote. Next slide. Like any class, like this, our classification is built for navigation and connection. It's built with increasing levels of granularity. And we do, as I mentioned, aim to submit for concepts for programs. Next slide. Sorry. Okay, so here we are. We have done everything in bold. Bravo, team. Anything that's not bold, it doesn't mean we haven't discussed it. It means there's a lot of kind of reorganization and placement going on, like some things that were material goods we really thought should be in health, some things in housing we thought should be in health, right? So we are sorting constantly across all of these different super types, even if they're not fully in bold. And I do want to note that there is our next principal area of work is on sorting education and enrichment and social connection and engagement, including changing the names of these different entities, these different groupings, because one of the things that we are trying to consider is given crossover between social connection and social enrichment, whether these should actually be the clustering. And that's kind of where we're leaning, but we're going to talk more when we come back next week. And then education can represent the educational statuses that are so critical and are a critical data element for so many health outcomes research, right? So you would have those elements we've addressed prior, like less than a high school education, less than a middle school education, right? So make sure you have a definition for it. Yes, and we do. Rob McClure, a bunch of nerdy terminologists at your service. You can ensure that Hamali and Monique will not let us get away without having definitions. We're working on the structure right now, but we are definitely working with the definitions in mind. Thanks, Rob. So good. Any other questions here? All right, next slide. Yes. Yes. Rob, if you ever want to come to a Friday afternoon snow med conversation, you're welcome to. I know you knew Homali. Yes. All right. And then as we did our sorting, these are some of those common themes that ground just basic dimensions of insecurity, and we can see them play out in how the sorting is happening, right? Basic insecurities range from worry through stability to quantity and presence and quality and safety and cultural acceptability. Some of our high level concepts, because really kind of break this model because they're so focused. You'll see that in things like material goods. But in general, we follow this structure as we go forward. Next slide. So you can see the primary need starts to get sorted through programs to stabilize the need, programs to acquire the need, or programs to improve the quality or safety of the need. You can see that happening with food, housing. That was how we started. It got complicated. We'll go into that very shortly. And transportation, right? So that was the initial premise. And then when we applied it, we started to have some kinks and wrinkles. And this is what it helped us arrive at where we are right now. Next slide. Again, so one of the things that's really important is I had to use my limbo, how low do we go? So our purpose is navigation and connection to services. This is the pattern we're seeing. We talked about it last time. We're gonna see it very clearly when we go into the classification, with the understanding that we are not able to present things that are protected by IP, but we do have friends from 211 here today. We see a pattern of granularity across the classification, with those program groupers being what is generally agreed upon at higher levels for the purposes of navigation. And this is the synthesis of three, essentially, of the different classifications. And then you can see gravity kind of sitting in the next level, and we'll go into the classification itself and talk through all of this. And then, because gravity had to define, Rob, this goes to what you said. Gravity had to have specific definitions for every single one of the programs. And so that, in order to submit to SNOMED CT, so we have these very discrete programs. And then gravity, what we noticed then after the gravity programs are the breadths of granularity that gravity did not drill down to, right? And you can see this in existing other classifications such as 211 HFAS. Right, so we have the groupers and concepts, we have gravity, and we're going to see this very shortly, and then we have this placeholder for levels of specificity that are really, really critical for connection to a service that you are eligible for, and critical for establishing outcomes, but are more granular than gravity can define to, but still represent this area of interest. And we'll see that very shortly, and our 211 friends are on the call. Next slide. So again, this is how it roughly flows out. And again, we're going to stop at the gravity program bit because of needing to respect the IP with 211 HIS, but you can see this is the way it plays out. So we have this primary need, and the facet of the primary need that creates these structures. The program type level is what we are leaning into. Like, how do we sort things into program types, right? And those are the concepts that we will be really focusing on for the purposes of this work. And then the program subtype level is where gravity comes in. These are specific programs, right? All of the federal programs, and something general enough to be applicable most anywhere, right? And then we start to see this other level where it's programs for specific conditions, or specific programs or specific conditions or specific populations, right? And so that's a level of granularity that gravity does not build down to. It's a level of granularity that's really critical for thinking about eligibility. And it's this knowledge base that we know exists out there. But we just note that it's not part of the program type classification at this time. We do want to note that each of these different classifications that exist do have layers of adding in aspects about the person. Each of them called them something different. But when it comes to age-based eligibility or specific subtypes of that you layer onto a program type, each of them have that as well. I hope that made sense. It's been a long day. It was a very long high-tech meeting today, so I talked a long, long time. We'll see this play out very shortly, so I'm going to keep on going. Next slide. So you can see this applied to transportation, right? So we have transportation, we have our three different subtypes, we have our program type class. This is where the classification sits, right? And then we have gravity coming in here. And you can see that we subdivide and subspecify. And then we know in the ecosystem, there are levels of granularity that are really helpful for us connecting to this program type that gravity does not subspecify to, right? So we just want to honor the fact that there is a ton of knowledge over here. But regardless, our work will enable mapping, as I mentioned in that earlier slide, across each of these different classifications, right? So mapping into the program type level, mapping to the gravity program subtype level, and then mapping to the specific programs that are represented in additional classifications. So again, some of the different solutions already do that internally, but this will be able to be something that is supported by this work. Next slide. You can also see it applying to food, right? So we have the three different, pathways from food. We have the program type level. And I forgot, I didn't put the education bullet bubble here, my apologies. And then we have the gravity program subtype level. And then there is a ton of granularity that subdivides program types into different subtypes. You can just say, like, you can just see very clearly that, there's a ton of different types of food pantries, right? There's a ton of different ways of giving people food, right? Gravity doesn't specify each of those. The first type in both slides seems to be a blend of two things. What do you mean, Rob?
What I mean, so you can go back to the first one, actually. I haven't read through the second bullet, but this also is similar to that. So you have gas assistance. So this one's probably not as clear as perhaps the next one, but you're giving gas. Now we don't give away gas at food at gas pantries like food pantries, but you're giving money, financial assistance to get gas. So that's the two things. So if you go to the next slide, it's definitely clear. There, you're giving financial assistance for food as opposed to giving food. So I think so is the intent those first three kind of help pay, receive, and educate? Is that always, remind me, so was that also true? So we're paying, receiving, and educating about transportation?
No,
And so that always then is replicated in the type because you're going to say, okay,
Not
so this is
always.
about a pay, and so this is financial assistance for food.
It's not always replicated, but it's a theme that helped us start to think about it. It gets broken.
But you're so that anything that's below that one item is always going to be you're receiving money.
Yes, yeah. Well, in this instance, yes.
Okay. All right. That
Yeah.
so because I was worried that we were kind of not capturing an important characteristic, but it sounds like you're getting that first characteristic in the very first lozenge. I
First
don't know what you want to
one.
call that.
Yeah, and what we are
Because it's
doing,
not a type, it's what are you calling that first thing that you're not calling type?
well, we call it level 0. Uh, because
Okay.
it was a level we didn't know we needed, right? And it's a level that's not going to necessarily we have to figure out whether it's actually part of the classification or not, but it did help us start to structure things, right? So right now,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so it helped because it is important.
Yes, exactly. Level 0.
So yeah, so it really shouldn't be level 0 in a sense.
Yeah,
It's a category for your types. We can
yes.
talk about that later, but because if you're doing it consistently across all your domains, then you might think it isn't a type, but it is.
No, yeah,
It's just a
yeah,
level 0 typer that you're applying everywhere.
100% agree. And we've been talking about this internally. Absolutely, right?
Okay, and the reason I'm saying this is that you're going to reason based on that lozenge.
Mm-hmm,
So you have to identify it as a concept.
mm-hmm. Yes. Absolutely. But if you can imagine that, yes, and we inserted that. The level 0 lozenge. But I want to know, let's go into housing because, and Rob, thanks. This is great. Because the housing starts to break it a little bit if we go next, because housing is so complicated. Next slide. I just reminded everybody about this before we get to housing. So Rob, when we had tried to just apply the 3 lozenges to housing, it got really hard, right? And so this is partly where we are right now. Luckily, it's only September 12th. But if we,
Well, yeah, you haven't shown it yet, and I don't want to. You don't want to get into the details, but just because you have some consistent lozenges, I think I love the fact that we're going to call them lozenges from now
yeah, I know.
on. They don't have to be the same in every domain.
No, correct.
Totally.
Absolutely. I know. But you were saying, you asked me about patterns, and I said,
Yeah. No,
that, yeah,
I mean, to the extent that they are the same, great, but
yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. So this is the thing. Yeah. So we started to level 0 lozenge. We started to recognize aligned with with the way we think about domains when we're doing domain build, right? Which is that worry to quality spectrum. We started to see that there was actually like a structure there. And Smees, you're being very quiet, but you all recognize that this is where we got to, right? And then sometimes when we thought about it that way, it actually got a little it got complicated specifically. Is there a need to break out? We do that a little bit in food. So if you were the classification was number one, something to note in the classification is most of the coding for food concepts, because they haven't been defined, you won't see in Gravity programs yet. So you won't see that in the list. But there is a way that you can see there's lots of capital S, capital N, capital A, capital P programs. And then there are programs that are not capitalized because they're not directly related to federal entitlement programs, and you can see that logic in there as well. And so we tried to allow for local instances of programs when that applies, like housing support programs or rental assistance programs, because sometimes rental assistance programs are not an entitlement, they're through your community land trust. And sometimes they're directly through the Public Housing Authority through a Section 8 housing voucher, right? So we try to build flexibility to allow local implementations and just go up to a theme that is able to represent all of the programs. But what we're starting to realize is there's gaps. So I hope that answered your question. So you could, when you download the spreadsheet tomorrow, you can see existing Gravity programs, and most of the federal programs are that we would, I hate the word entitlement, but it is the word, are capital S, capital N, capital A, capital P, or capital W, capital I, capital C, right? Or, the farmers, any of the programs under the Gus Schumacher nutrition program that used to be called Finny, right? We name all of those, but we also create space for other programs. And sorry, that was a deep food insecurity nerdy dive, but that's what you get when your terminology director is a former food insecurity SME. Okay, now Rob, let's get any other questions from let's go into housing actually, because it'll be fun. And then we're going to go into the table. Fun, she says. Okay, so one of the things that happened when we started to think about housing is that it's complicated, right? It's complicated because housing is complicated, and major kudos to the SMEs. I think it was like a month that we talked about housing, because housing is really complicated, right? So we have some things that are similar. So with that concept of stability, you can see it. So any type of, and I just put placeholders here because we're going to move to the classification itself to start going through this so everybody can see. There's programs to stabilize the need. Again, those, finding housing or like, rental assistance programs, right? Like home buyer education. And then there's programs to acquire the need. There's programs to acquire the need that have specific populations. And this is really critical because unlike some programs, if you're unhoused, and you have a substance use disorder, there's really only one place you can go, right? Or if you are incarcerated and transitioning into the community and you don't have a place to go, there's really only one place to go, right? So we are trying to consider this, and there's a caveat on the classification that will come. We also have, of course, programs to include the quality or safety of the need. So in those top 4 bullets, you can see the stability and housing, under housing and security, you can see housing instability, homelessness, and inadequate housing, right? These are all concepts that Gravity has leaned into in some shape or form. There's some gaps there. insofar as like not all housing programs are related to housing instability or homelessness or inadequate housing. But you can see that there. But then when we hit the, we started to think about it and thinking about the requirements of connecting with housing and thinking about the role of coordinated entry and thinking about if we're really actually trying to navigate and connect, it's really important with housing to consider the role of housing navigation and the role of coordinated entry. Because if I'm an individual who is seeking housing, that's where in some instances it's just where I have to go, right? So in this instance, because of the complexity of the domain and because of the unique needs of housing, we created this programs to assist with need-specific navigation. You'll see that very shortly. And one thing I want to note, you'll see this on the slide as well. We do note that programs to acquire the need for specific populations is likely just a subtype of the programs to acquire the need. We just are kind of weighing that right now. Like, does it go at this level because I can only, if I, it's like a must have, or does it go to the next level? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, like kind of like basically like is the primary definition based on like one way to classify it versus the primary definition is maybe based on the population.
Exactly. And you'll see this because what we tried to do in the classification is carry all of these questions over as comments, so they'll persist. It seems that we may need multiple. Yes, this is some, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, as I look at this, I think you guys, to some degree, you probably were struggling with the fact that you thought you only could get one lozenge level. And in fact, what I'm seeing, particularly when I think about this as a functional grouper, is that you're actually just identifying sometimes multiple levels as a primary facet.
Exactly. This is
like,
yeah.
These are stabilizing issues. Oh, what I need is to stabilize your access to housing versus I need to stabilize the quality of your housing. Those are really, they bring in the same. Maybe they bring in the same. Maybe I'm not actually, as I think about that more. But I'm sure you're being driven by what agency do we need to contact or what access,
Absolutely,
financial access, and all that sort of stuff. And so, I number one, I mean, obviously this is great stuff, but I think I wonder if you felt like we need to make these all one level when in fact they're really kind of multiple levels.
Well, that's exactly, I think, where we're at with the programs to acquire the need and programs to acquire the need for specific populations is
Right.
really
Yeah.
what we think about it.
Exactly.
Bye, Jacob, you're the best. It's actually a second branch, right? And so that's just where we are right now. But we're
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So now next slide. I think we have one more slide and then we're going to go to the classification. So, two more slides. My apologies. So one thing this is like I mentioned this in the beginning. So I should have known that this exercise would reveal all kinds of gaps in gravity concepts. It's like the bi-directional looking. It's like we build from this way, and now we're actually analyzing from the back. So that one of our program enhancement areas was program analysis, and this has been an incredible program analysis. So on the classification, we have a key to follow it because each of the classification itself has created different action items. There's action items internally for the classification SMEs to review and right? And there's also like action items for gravity to lean into because it's a gap. And so you can see this as we present the classification. So there's gaps and roles, like the housing navigator. We didn't have a concept for it. It's so important. We have different kinds. We have digital navigator. We have different types of navigators. We don't have a housing navigator. That's a gap, right? Benefits navigator, another gap, maybe if we feel like we want it. We haven't gotten there yet, but housing navigator rises to the top, and just noting that specific element is so intertwined in Medicaid operational implementations of waivers and loops. I'm having a moment. But if you look at the Medicaid CHIP covered services table that was released last year from as part of the White House SDOH toolkit, housing navigation is woven all throughout that as being a critical covered service. We also see gaps in programs. We didn't have infant food and diapers. We just had formula. I don't know how. I'm a pediatric family medicine provider. I don't know how we missed that. Community nutrition education programs like the critical, like YMCA supported diabetes prevention program, evidence-based, very supported. Some of those food programs I mentioned, so somebody was talking about food programs, like there are gaps. We only have one of the 6 concepts that we're talking about, I think, this fall represented in our terminology. So we need to lean into that. We talked some specific housing interventions and housing devices. I do want to note that we drastically increased our specific provision of X resource when we were trying to support New York in the terminology to support their waiver, but it has created some what are the correlating program conversations for gravity. And then we do want to note that there's a gap in our supportive housing subtypes for unhoused individuals with specific clinical needs. And I just mentioned that, right? So we have this like one type, we think about that, the tree there, the finding shelter and then finding shelter for specific populations. We have a lot of work to do there. Very, very, very simple, very common national definitions that we're leaning into. We're going to go into the classification in a second, so we'll show all this to you. Next slide. All right, so I think Sarah moved the direct link because I was taking you to a place that I forgot is in the SME files and it's not universally accessible. I'm going to share my slide very shortly because I tried to do housing on a slide. It was just too hard. And I was like, let's just walk through the classification and how to review it. The spreadsheet I'm about to review is the spreadsheet that will be on the Confluence and is the master, right? Our masters for this work do not look like other masters. Our masters for this work are unique and are more like it's a spreadsheet with columns with increasing granularity. And so I have captured comments that I have for the SMEs and that in cells or their comment that we're discussing internally. I want anyone who reviews the classification to see that we're still thinking through things and there's no reason to have you ask a question we're already asking. Or maybe you can see my questions and send back a helpful insight. Like Rob, maybe you'll be like, oh, this question, here's this answer, and send it an email. And then we do have a key to help identify concepts and process, and this is how we track all the action items I mentioned. So anything purple is a gravity potential concept gap. Anything green and bold is something that we're working on internally with our SMEs, and anything that's to be determined. Italics, we put them in there because I wanted you all to see concepts that are incoming that aren't available yet in gravity value sets. We've done a lot of work. Again, specifically really supporting the waiver, but also we have all of our utility and security concepts coming down the pike. We know that they're coming, right? So I didn't want them to be not represented, even if they're not released in SNOMED CT yet or not integrated into our value sets, because our value set release is only twice a year, just because we had to have a process. And all hail Somali and Sarah for that work. All right, so with that key being noted, I'm going to go ahead and share and have you walk through the classification with me. Sound like a plan? And then Hamali will snag it back. All right, so I'm going to go to just trying to figure out the version of Chrome. I'm just going to do my desktop because that's easier. All right, so we're going to go here. So here we are with the classification. So this is the consensus document that we're using. It is able to be engaged in. You're going to download it tomorrow and then help us figure out things. And I'm going to show you where the key is represented. It's over here. So purple is gravity is considering gaps. Green is thinking, right? And italics is gravity concepts that aren't available yet in value sets, right? And so if you think about going down what we have here, and so this is the, Rob, just to build off a little bit. So we have this, because you were asking all the questions. The first level is the domain, the highest level domain of need. I need help with food. And these are some suggested concepts that I created to help trigger conversation internally with the SMEs. Like I need help with food. I need help with housing. I need help with transportation, right? And that's kind of aligned with Maslow, right? Hierarchy of needs. And then the next level, that used to be lozenge level 0, but is actually a level, is, and you can see that when it actually gets into the classification, there's more specific namings than I had in the slides, right? So we've been refining the name to represent the concepts that are inside the program type grouper in C. So what about food do I need help with? I need help receiving food. I need help paying for food. I need help with nutrition education, right? I need help paying for rides. I need help with actual rides. I need help with maintenance on a ride. And it's ride to be inclusive because we care about bicycles. If Owen is on the call, he's not on the call, but just to show anyone in this meeting next Thursday doesn't know I spoke about bicycles for Owen. So that is the general logic. And then you see these groupers happening here in C, right? So this is kind of where the C is where the greatest consensus work is. So B we created to help us structure C. And it's, again, as Rob is mentioning, it is a level of the classification, right? It like by design. C is the synthesis of each of the different classifications of reference and agreement on an initial consensus term, right? So you have community gardens, food pantry, food box pre-prescription, et cetera. And again, this is the first instance of seeing this level. Naming is in process. So when you submit concepts, you'll see, if we go back to the slides, the homework is that name doesn't make sense, right? And we want to think like, we have our friend Molly Blumgart, who came in from United, who's been, just as a new voice merging in a couple weeks ago, she had comments on names that made sense. So grateful for anyone helping us with names. Remember, the idea is to improve the function of this as a resource for navigating to and connecting to services. So this is the program type level, which is the synthesis of all of those different classifications. Not all of them, the three primary ones of reference within the healthcare ecosystem and the integrative ecosystem. Gravity is over here in D. So this is when we start to analyze gaps. So we use the gravity programs as both as a cross-check to make sure our program type groupers are sufficient. Like looking back, like do we have a concept for X? And you can see this throughout the classification. And we also use it to identify gaps in gravity terms. And you can see this in purple when we're like, we don't have grocery delivery. Where does it go? Right. And so because our value sets are built for specific purposes like food insecurity, this is something that might be in a different value set, or it might be here. We're going to be thinking about it, but just noting that this is a gap. This is a good example of a comment, right? So I have questions for the SMEs about whether grocery delivery is right in the right place, right? Or whether it should be in an ADL supportive place, right? I also have comments on medically tailored meals as a super type, because medically tailored meals is a specific type, right? So these are things that we're working on internally as we go forward, and you can see we preserved the comments here. What I want to note is there's a missing E, and it's for our friends from 211, right? So like where we think about different classifications fitting in is any classifications that's more specific could be sorted in E, right? So you have the gravity concept, you have the highest level grouper, you have the gravity concept, and you have a more specific classification capacity. And once we have terminology, like encoded terminology, we can map as we see fit. So here we go down the whole thing. You can see carried out through food. Transportation has those three high-level concepts: paying for rides, actual rides, and maintenance on rides. Again, you can keep on seeing purple concepts that gravity's elevating is something we need to consider. Housing, so again, it's a little bit different, the names of them, Rob, which helps because this is part of what you were thinking about the lozenges on the other slide. So programs that help find shelter for people, right? Including programs that offer, and parentheses are includes but not limited to, that we're using for right now, just to understand, just as we're trying to think about naming conventions. You can see that, so that is the, and then you have finding and keeping permanent housing, which is a refinement and slight difference from how we presented housing on the slides. And this includes affordable housing programs. You can see all kinds of names, right? So name and process to include all the program types, name and process to include all the program types here. So we have another subtype, which is maintaining and improving housing quality and safety. This was because we started with fixing or weatherizing your home, and then we realized it wasn't inclusive, right? So we stepped back, analyzed. Molly came in with an idea. And so this is a green work in progress, and I highlight that in the comment. And you can, again, so what happens is you can see the program type grouper in C and then the gravity plugin in D. And I'm trying to build space between them as we go forward. In health and safety supporting home devices as this program type grouper, in italics, you can see everything coming in from the waiver, right? So these are all new concepts that we had to build provision of X for to support the 1115 waiver in New York, because it's I mean, and again, it all aligns with the Medicaid CHIP covered services table from last year, because we had to cross-check against federal applicability. So we used that Medicaid CHIP covered services table to a T. Molly can testify. Monique can testify. Lots of Medicaid regulation checking at all times.
Sarah?
Yeah, hi.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to interject real fast, just because in case anyone has questions, if you scroll up just a little bit, the category for, because I just think it's an important call out, the finding and keeping permanent housing. Can you make a note on the decision around clinical housing types?
Oh,
Kind of being removed, because I think that's an important absence from this group if people don't know why it was made that way.
Okay, and so we moved housing for specific
So like, especially if you're, coming from like the ADL or dementia
Yeah.
care or disability space, all
Yeah.
of those like, RCFEs and boarding cares and things like that, that are for that kind of support, that does not live in this category.
Okay. Okay, I did that right here. I put it as a second comment on this cell. Okay, awesome. Sound good?
So I also have a question. So we've got things broken into rows. I know this is an Excel thing
Yeah.
that I'm focusing on, but and I'm not sure honestly how important what I'm about to say is, but you have the gravity level thing on its
Mhm.
own row, but everything else is lumped in with that gravity level thing into one row. And I'm sensing that's because, so is the program type groupers something that we're defining, or is that coming from IP stuff?
No, so this is here. So I didn't do this here. You're so smart, right?
Well, before you go too far on this about being smart even, is that I would rather, if I'm going back and forth on kind of multi-hierarchy, single hierarchy
Yeah.
thoughts on this, but to the extent that as we create it, I would like for us to break each thing that's distinct that we're naming into its own row. So
I hear you.
day shelter, if day shelter and emergency shelter go into are the same idea, they go in one row. If they're not, they're two rows. The
Yes.
things that then are below them, like gravity programs, will need to decide, are they one or the other? If it's a single hierarchy, it may not be. That could be really true, that like, well, this is both this and that. And so in that context, we have to talk about whether you repeat it or not. But the things that we're making, which I think these first two, well, I got three columns, but column B and C, those two are, I think, need to be on their own row and should be single hierarchy things. Maybe the gravity program things that are down in D, really you're going to want to be under more than one, and we can talk about how we handle that. But do you understand what I'm saying?
I entirely agree. And the reason I didn't do this because it's so initial and primary, and
Yeah.
and like splitting cells in Google Sheets is maddening, like maddening.
No, okay,
Yeah.
good. So at
But
least
I will
mentally we're on the same model.
mentally we are on the same row. Well, literally.
Because
Yeah,
what I
100%.
worry a little bit about, because I think it's going to be, it's obviously straightforward given the way it's set up, that all of the items in C are an item of B type. And that's where we would kind of think about them. But I do think that if we're also defining Ds, we need to decide what of the Cs they are.
Yeah, and that's what I've tried to do so far. Apparently I
You're
didn't.
putting spaces.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
yeah.
is hard
I
to
know
do.
it's mediocre. It's a
Okay.
mediocre solution. I'm entirely
All
that.
right. Well, spaces will help. Spaces will help.
Yes. But there's still some sorting to do, but I've tried. I think probably I did better job with spaces later, right? You're right. And you can blame me, Rob. The intent is to do a line
No
by
blame
line.
necessary.
I know. But the problem is with so much sorting to do still, when we started to apply the line by line and all the changes we were making, it was just like an organizational sticky wicket. But yes, that's the goal. And the final, what people will be voting on will be that in the end. It'll be a crisp row by row for every unique concept with repeating higher level concepts across it. And luckily, I happen to know Molly's really good at this. Knowing the work she does in the ecosystem. Yeah, so that's the plan eventually. But for right now, because there's so many things moving around, this is where we are. Sound good? Yes? Sounds like it. Oh, did you guys lose me? Or are we good?
Yes, that
Okay.
sounds fine.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so I think we have a general sense of, and again, understanding that I'm trying to create space, and I promise to try to fix the space by the time it's uploaded onto the Confluence tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific time. The space sorting I will finish, but you can see it here, like in housing, maintaining, improving housing quality and safety. There is this, roughly trying to figure out how the space aligns. The space can support the different concepts. And then you can see, so we have housing, we go into utilities, we go into, and it's easier with utilities because there's not as much complexity in column C, right? And then in employment, we've covered as well. And then in material goods, we have finished that as well. So we have done a rough, first classification across food, transportation, housing, utilities, employment, and material goods. Everything in green or anything with a comment is something we're still working on and trying to sort through. Everything in purple is something that Gravity is sorting through just on whether we need to fill that concept. And then everything in italics is a concept you will not find in a Gravity value set, but Gravity already made it, and it's just coming in from New York. Whew. Any questions? I imagine I need to finish the spacing, which I didn't finish, and then let you all review. Any thoughts or questions? And again, understanding that, Rob, even in further levels of granularity, there would be a potential mapping in a column E with alternate taxonomies, right? So every unique concept has a row, and then if you did an additional mapping, you would have repeated rows at column D even, because there would be subtypes of in column E. Monique, hi.
Hi, Sarah, and you may have mentioned this, but at the top of this, in the Gravity program column were actual program type things. But sometimes they're not programs, they're actually things.
No, I know.
Like
No,
an
I know.
air conditioner, right? So
yeah, this is why I said that. And like, we really need
Okay.
to figure out how this, so this is, I think I said this in the slides, but didn't say it here, and you're so.
Yeah, repeated, yeah.
Yeah. Is that these are all things that correlate. So you can see all the italics, right? These are all things that we had to build for the specific provision of air conditioner, provision of dehumidifier, provision of humidifier, provision of air filtration device. And these are certainly all the types of things that happen at places that do health and safety supporting home device programs, but that's not a program, right? So part of the reason why it's here, and Himali and Sarah Bahal and I were just talking, and Himali and I were slacking about it in the Gravity terminology Slack as well. Gravity in this instance has to figure out, like, what's the program supertype, right? And what we can defend, right? Because at this level, it's all a direct service and a thing. It's not a program type, right? does that support your?
Yeah, they're the output of some kind of program that you go to.
Yeah.
They're the intervention that the program does. And at the top, some of them were actual programs, like, you know, you can evaluate for those programs. But these
Yeah.
bottom, some of the things, there's a mix, and you must have mentioned that on an earlier slide, but here it
Yeah.
really shows, you know.
Yeah, it does really show, right? Because I didn't want to get to the classification exercise, and I probably should just do a note here. Note in the especially in material goods, because this is again one thing about material goods is that it's very like it's all receiving things. They're all programs where you go to get stuff by the nature of the domain, right? But trying to figure out what the program type is as opposed to the thing is going to be tricky, right? But that's work we need to do. There definitely are programs that give safety helmets. There definitely are programs that give you furniture, but is that it's hard to figure out how that ties in with gravity. Because one of the things Molly and I were talking about is where do you refer to get X, right? Like I refer to a program to help people, but we have there's not a microwave program, or maybe there is. But we need to defend that if there is.
Well, and it might be related again to food. The microwave's related to food. The air conditioner may be related to utilities. You know, it's something we'll have to sort out.
Yeah, and the material goods section will always be the trickiest section because everything in it likely applies to something else. And the good thing, one thing I did not say is we're very comfortable in the fact that like our program types may be sorted across multiple first level concepts. Like we are acknowledging that you're going to find clothing in both, you might find clothing in both like employment concepts and material goods concepts. And that's to be determined, but it's likely.
So can I ask, I mean, some of the things, yeah, I get that is hard. You've got SMEs who participate or participants who participate that are, you know, living this, not only in terms of delivering it, but also in classifying it. I'm thinking of you 211. And so they must be giving you some advice with regards to, I mean, you're right, there is no microwave program. But are there even appliance programs?
Yes. No, this is where, yes. This is where, but I have to admit, this material goods, Rob, this is this morning.
Okay.
It's so
Yeah.
gentle.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, a lot of times the place that you go to get these sorts of things, like I'm actually on a grant, a local grant program that hands out grants in behavioral health, but really all health. And one of the new things was God, what do they call themselves? But it's a furniture, it's like a food pantry, but it's a furniture pantry, right? For housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. For unhoused people, for housing, you know, like you finally got a house. Oh, but yeah, maybe you need a bed. So that's probably the level that you're going to be at. And most of these are going to be, yeah, they're not going to be named programs because none of the programs think of them that way. They just think about, I do all these things. And now they have to classify themselves. So again, I just think that 211 and others who are already trying to find, like, I need to put this tag on this program so that I know to call the Jimmy Smith Foundation for this thing, right? Instead of more Jimmy Smiths.
Well, I was just gonna say, you know, like I think like because of funding codes and things like that, a lot of these things are already, you know, kind of categorized and tagged and things like that. But I do hear you on like attaching that. It's and maybe that's also where, you know, groupers come in different ways too.
Yeah, I mean, maybe what you're saying, and I'm not surprised to hear this because people have such a kind of like a a funding oriented way of thinking about it, because that's who's got the capabilities. But anyway, what we're being asked to do is something probably that hasn't been done before, which is to say, but really, you know, when you think of this class of things, and it, you know, like determining that hard goods or, you know, appliances are a category that people haven't actually named before, but we know exists, is what the hard work of doing what we got to do.
And it is, yeah, and I think it is work that, and again, this is why I put it here, those brave SMEs, they knew I was just throwing it out. But yeah, I don't think it's, I think it is hard work, but it's not dissimilar to work that we've done above. I'm just forcing the issue because I didn't want to have nothing here.
Right, for today. Yeah, no, I get it.
Today, I wanted to I wanted to know that these so the program type grouper is clear. It's where it's gravity's work to do this next level, right? Like what and or maybe bidirectional, because everything that's happening is like we note these gaps and then we look backward. But anyway, it's fun times. Fun times. All right, any other thoughts? This is, you know, it's a really great conversation so far. Okay, noting I'm going to create the spaces because I didn't do that, especially in housing. It got overwhelming. Housing was just generally overwhelming. I need to like sort the different types. And there's a lot of to be determined in housing. Like just to go back up there, like there's concepts that we have in our gravity value sets that don't necessarily belong well within the type. You can see this like in finding shelter. There's concepts that really should be elsewhere, and I'm asking this, but I can't make that decision with SMEs. I just don't know if we've highlighted them yet. I mean, I can't make this decision without SMEs, and so I asked it today, but I didn't get a chance to ask it this morning. But when I was thinking, when I was doing the spacing, I was like, wait a minute, right? So more to come on that, but I feel like we're in pretty good position. And again, congratulations, SMEs, on getting to a point that involved the consensus and synthesizing of so much effort since May 16th. Bravo to all of you. And this will be uploaded tomorrow by 5 p.m. Pacific time. And look forward to comments. And Rob, just like the comments you made, look forward to further comments. And we can go for any other final thoughts before we go back to the slides to close ourselves out. Happiness. Happy work. No comments, everyone's stunned. All right, I'm stopping share. Hamali, take over, and then you'll present the slides and I'll close this out. Thank you. Okay, I hope this review was helpful because I didn't want to send anybody into the review without talking about the organization of the classification. All right. I think we have a couple more slides. Look at this sweet little crew. Matt's still here. Elena's still here. Do you have your last slides, Hamali? Look at my sleepy dog.
Sarah, do you want me to put next slide?
Oh, I can't see anything.
Oh,
Am I the only one? I don't see anything.
I can
I
stop it.
can see them.
No, we see it.
Oh.
Let me stop
Oh,
sharing.
maybe is it just me who can't see? How is that
I
possible?
think it was just you, Sarah.
Okay. Oh, there I can see it now. I don't know. I was in a world of my own. All right. We just presented on this. Next slide. All right. We didn't have any questions, so next slide. And this is the homework is the most important thing. Next slide. All right, you're always welcome to catch up, but specifically for this, the draft classification will be posted on the Confluence and underneath the cross-domain enhancements by tomorrow at 5 p.m. Pacific time. I promise to figure out the spacing by then, before then. And then we want you to review and send back written comments. Really in emails the best because just, you know, like in just cells, rows, you know, concept, this thought, to gravityproject@hl7.org. You're always welcome to just come back to the next meeting on 9/26 to keep talking. things that are really critical, and you heard us talk about this on naming and location, like, is it in the right place? Is this the right name? Right? And then we'll come back in 2 weeks and keep chatting. Any other thoughts before we go? Good job, team. Thank you so much. And I will see the SMEs next week. And thank you so much. So the classification will be posted tomorrow afternoon. Bye, friends.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.